A very good evening, a warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Norman Goodfellows, and welcome to yet another new location on the show. We find ourselves today at the Brookfield Development, part of Royal Developments at Royal Johannesburg. Now, if you look that way, you have got the east course of Royal Johannesburg, which, amongst other things, is home to about 300 or 400 golf balls that I've lost over the last 5 years or so, clearly down to poor course design rather than my ability as a golfer. It is also home to the Old Oak restaurant, where Dan Really Likes Wine as a show has spent many a happy hour, and where I've hosted a number of lovely wine dinners under the guidance of Chef Ransley Peterson. And this is a brand new property development which has the challenge that I'm faced with a little later on this evening. Now, I've been asked in the wine events I do to do a number of pairings, mostly food pairings, but occasionally they've been a little different. Pair one with a sport, pair one with a mood, pair one with something that's another drink with some whiskey, or try and find a different way of doing wine. It's the first time I've ever had to pair wine with property. And so I've been racking my brain for lines along the take of this delightful and restrained property speaks to the nature of the wine. We'll see if we get it right this evening. It's all a bit of fun. But the chance to showcase the new Brookfield property here in Johannesburg, looks out over the golf course. It's already proving very popular. And together with Chef Ransley, I'll be hosting a couple of hundred people later on this evening, showing them where we are and introducing them to a brand new development overlooking the golf course. So that's my challenge for later on. My challenge for today is to find out if my guest can possibly have done all of the outrageous things he lays claim to in one of the most entertaining books I've read for some time. I go back probably a month or so, and the regular lunch that I have with Michael Fridjon, where we normally solve most of the world's problems by the end of lunch, but can't remember them by the next day. And he told me the story of a Danish aristocrat who parachuted into the Vietnam War and then decided he wanted to head off to South Africa to make wine, and somehow became one of the modern greats and the mythical figure of winemaking, first in France and now in Sicily, where he finds himself. Well, it turns out that all of these things Michael told me are largely true, it would appear, but I wanted to find out from the man himself. And so a very special guest in just a moment joins me on the show, and we will introduce him and give him due credit for the extraordinary life he has led in wine and surrounds. That comes in just a moment. I will apologize in advance. Now, there is still some construction being done around us, so you might get a slight interruption from one or two over-enthusiastic builders. But in between that, the story of an extraordinary wine character who has very firm roots in South Africa. Before we go over and find him in his home in Sicily, though, here's a quick look at one or two pieces of news from the world of wine. All right, let's start with the De Toren Fusion 5, the 2020. And this is pre-released. De Toren, one of the great Stellenbosch estates, who specialize very firmly in reds. And the Fusion 5 is one of the wines with which they made their name. They've had some newer ones arrive of late. The Malbec that came out, the Book 17, the Black Lion, all wines that are very much in the four-figure price category, speaking of brand, although on today's exchange rate, if you're watching this in Europe or America, that's a handful of change. And this is now available on pre-release, our version of En Primeur by the estate. And as always, it is exactly what De Toren do so well from that part of Stellenbosch, focus on rich, luscious Bordeaux variety-inspired red blends. I haven't tried the Fusion 5 yet. It is on its way, but I thought I'd let you know because it doesn't tend to hang around for very long. So if you'd like to add some of the 2020 De Toren Fusion to your cellar, then get hold of it now. It's an interesting vintage so far from what I've tasted from 2020, but I'm also more and more of the opinion that as much as we can give a sweeping judgment, 2015 was big and bold across the board in Stellenbosch and Rockstar, and 2017 elegant and lovely and grew into itself. While those are largely accurate, they're not entirely, and they're often estates that buck the trend on a particular vintage. So I'd definitely advise you to have a taste of this if you happen to be in the Stellenbosch area. You can get out to De Toren, but if you know their wine, then want to add. Remember that so many of the wines that we looked at, I think of 16 as a vintage in particular, where initially we were a bit Not so convinced about it. I'm finding a lot of 16 is really starting to hit its stride, so possibly one to look at. And this is coming up on Monday from the Van Arnhem dynasty. In fact, I suspect the previous proprietor, Achim, would know today's guest. They were working at a similar time. This is Taquan, who'll be joining me, Achim Van Arnhem's son. He'll be coming up to Johannesburg, and you can join us at Norman Goodfellows in Fourways on Monday evening for a Haute Cabrera tasting. And yes, there will be the Pierre Jordan bubbles, I'm sure, but the real focus is the brand new still range of wine out of the Franschhoek Valley. Remember, we had Taquan on the show a couple of weeks ago talking about this, headlined by that family reserve, but also with a Pinot Noir in particular that is getting a great deal of interest. So one for you to have a look at and come down and join us for. So if you are free, if you're in the greater Johannesburg area, we'd love to have you down at Norman Goodfellows at Fourways to have you down there on Monday. Right, and then just a piece of news in terms of my movements over the next little while. So I'm heading off to Italy, which again is rather important for the context of this evening's show, because my guest is in Italy. I'm not going to see him, sadly, although I've promised to try and do so as soon as I can. Instead, I'm off the Amalfi Coast, and as preparation, I've got some Italian guests on the show on Monday. We'll be live from that Norman Goodfellows store, and we'll be talking to, amongst others, Forti, the great South African chef, about what I should be eating in Italy, what I should be drinking in Italy, and what is making Italian wine stand out. It's far more than just the super Tuscans and the varietals that might roll off the tongue in terms of what you think Italian wine is about. There's far more to it. And in fact, I suspect today's guest will be able to tell me about that. We'll get to that part of his story a little later. There's so much in the build-up. So let me bring in the man who kept me awake till 1 o'clock this morning because I could not put his book down. He has led a life of great adventure and a life filled with many great wine stories, some of which we will be sharing with you today, all the way from Sicily and his Montecarrubo property. Peter Vinding-Diers. Peter, warm welcome. Thank you very much to the show for joining us. And this is quite a landmark because I can tell you, Peter, officially, you're the very first Scandinavian aristocrat who's trained as a winemaker in South Africa we've ever had on the show.
Thank you very much. Great thing. It's very nice to be the first in something.
Well, welcome on. And it's, as I mentioned in the intro, it was a conversation over lunch with a mutual friend of ours in Michael Fridjon, who told me this crazy story. And I thought Michael had been drinking heavily for breakfast again and thought this couldn't possibly be true. And then I went and did some research and discovered that the legend was in fact true. It makes it a difficult one to kick off with, though, because it is such a remarkable story. But maybe just a snapshot of the background. Danish aristocrat, related through your, I think it was your stepmother, to the Renoir family. You somehow found yourself in the American army in the Vietnam War, and then decided to come to South Africa. In a snapshot, tell us how all of that came about, and you found yourself in South Africa.
Well, I did a trip when I was young around Africa and the Far East, and I was very, very lucky to arrive at Cape Town. It was a beautiful, I did it on a freighter, and we sailed in. It was an absolutely breathtaking view of the Table Mountain from the sea. And then some of my stepfather's relations, the Dierses, lived in Cape Town, and they very kindly took me around and showed me a lot of things, amongst others, Group Constantia. And it made a wonderful impression on me. And I couldn't forget it. And so when I decided to make wine my life, I chose South Africa, not France, because my father and my grandfather lived in France half their lives. And I was not going to be daddy's boy. So I wanted to go somewhere where I did it all on my own. And that has really been what I've done ever since.
Speaking of that, just as a precursor to the start of that South African adventure, I'm fascinated by the Vietnamese angle of the tale. Having spent some time in Vietnam, my honeymoon was in Vietnam. From Michael, and then from reading through the book as well, it was a desire to, I guess, to test your mettle, because it was one of your relatives, an aunt, I think, who was involved in the Danish resistance in World War II. Is that correct?
It was my mother. it was my mother, and in fact, the whole family was involved. But my mother got a gong from the English after the war, and it was perhaps not so much that it was being brought up amongst all these fantastic heroes and legends that made me want to test myself, really. And I was staying with the ambassador, the Danish ambassador in Bangkok, and I explained to him, and he was one of the great resistance people. And so he immediately took the phone and rang up, and I flew over to Saigon and got assigned to the 101st Airborne Division and jumped with them at Pleiku. But that was something. I mean, parachutes in those days were not where they are today. So it felt like you felt like dropping like a stone. I was convinced that nobody could hit me. It went so fast, all of it. But later I did Aden, and I did other things as a war correspondent. And yes, it was a great experience.
Well, I'm very glad nobody did hit you.
Unfortunately, to me, war is something horrible, and I don't wish it on anybody. And now we live in a time where everybody thinks it's fun. I can't understand why young people should go out to their deaths for the whims of others. But I won't get involved in this conversation too much. I better remain a little neutral.
Like I'm very glad that you got through all of that safely, because it allowed you to begin this really interesting new chapter. And you'd, as you say, you'd sailed around the Cape, you'd stopped off, you'd had a first look at Groot Constantia, not realizing the role it would play in your future life. What was it about both wine as a whole and about South Africa, and it must have been more than just a beautiful view, that made you decide wine is my future and South Africa is where I would like to try and make that wine to start with?
Well, I fell in love with South Africa first time, and I wanted to come back there. It was fruitful. So when we arrived in Cape Town, Sydney Back answered the phone and took me on, mainly because I had an agricultural education from Denmark. And so I knew about pigs. I tried to get away from pigs all my life, but here was an occasion to actually learn viticulture during the day, and then over the weekends tend to his pigs. It worked out very well.
Not the most auspicious start to a glamorous winemaking career, and neither was when you set off, because you'd got in touch with KWV, hadn't you, wanting to come out, and they'd pretty much rejected you, so you didn't really have a job offer when you arrived.
No, it's true, but the man put his name on the paper, and I rang him up, and he was very surprised. I actually called him from Cape Town and said, "What now?" And so he gave me Sydney Back's telephone number. And so I got through to him. And as I say, he was very kind to me. And after about, half a year or something with Sydney Back, he needed the house I stayed in for some German winemaker. And then I found a job with Need4Buy, the Experimental Research Institute. And that, I think, has proved one of the most important steps in my life in wine. It was quite amazing. Van Zyl was the director and one of the kindest of men, and really I loved my stay there. I became assistant to Desjeux Pongrans, and he became godfather to my oldest son. and it was to have such a mentor and such nice people. And Need for Buy was full of super intelligent people who really cared for what they were doing. And it was the best school that one could ever go to.
It was part of this wonderful South African wine education that you fell into in so many ways. And it also included working at Rustenburg. I think that was the next stage from there. And also working with the man we now know on Rustenburg labels as simply R.M. Nicholson. He was Reg Nicholson to you. Well, what was that experience like?
Yes. It was fantastic. He was the most extraordinary man. I can't say too many good things about him. He was fantastic to me. And in my library, and I'm walking into the library. I hope we keep the connection. But in my library, I have this picture of him in the cellar. Can you see it?
I can indeed.
Yeah. Oh yeah. A great mentor. A wonderful person. And I loved working with him. And he let me do everything. And if I made a mistake or had a doubt, I could go to him. But otherwise, I had to get on with it. And that was something I learned. So whenever somebody have worked with me since, I always let them make their mistakes. And then if they were bad mistakes, tell them why they shouldn't have done it. But that I learned from Reg, and he's one of the most important people, I think, in my life in wine.
And at that time, you'd now been in South Africa for a while. You'd kind of found your feet. How long did it take you to decide, yep, this is definitely what I want to do. This is where I've found my space, and that wine is going to be my life?
Immediately. I was convinced it was to be my life. Absolutely convinced. And of course, Need for Buy, with all their research and so on, it grabbed me like anything. I've been a researcher ever since. There's so many things. Right at the moment, we are working with bacteria spraying instead of sulfur copper sulfate in the vineyards, and it works very well. And all my series about yeast and so on, of course, it all came from Need for Buy. So yes, I have a lot to be thankful for.
Well, as do we, because you've added a wonderful story to the South African winemaking heritage, and it prepared you for heading off to Bordeaux. Before we talk about that chapter in your life, the time that you spent, how much do you think this distinctly South African wine education prepared you for what was to come when you headed off to France? What did it equip you and arm you with for what was to follow?
I don't know. Martin Bamford from Gilbey's came and visited South Africa and came to Rustenburg and saw what we were doing there and tasted the wines. And then he wrote me a letter saying that he needed somebody like me in Bordeaux. And so I went to the vineyard with Reg and said, what shall I do? And he was about to retire, and I was about to take his place. And he immediately said, you must go. It is a must for anybody who loves wine to be past Bordeaux sometime in your life. And so off I went.
And you went off, and it was...
well, my successor, very funnily, was somebody I worked with at Need for Buy, and Etienne Leriche. And we still see each other. And it's a very small world, really. So last time I was in South Africa, I visited him, and I saw the old vats and the old machinery that we'd used at Rustenburg, which he'd bought when they modernized the place. And it was absolutely marvelous. It brought tears to my eyes.
I was going to ask about some of those names. There's such a warmth of recollection as you speak about those particular times. You mentioned Etienne. I'd imagine so many of those friendships were enduring, and that although you might have left, those connections remained very firmly in place.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very close friends with Eben Sadi. And in fact, funny enough, Eben's son has just worked for my son, who now makes this beautiful wine in Patagonia in Argentina. And Eben's son has just done a stint for him there. And in fact, thanks to him, we're going to have a young South African girl coming here who's got a master's in viticulture and things. And I'm very much looking forward to her helping me with this vintage. So there we are, it turns around.
Well, inspired in no small part, I'm sure, by your own adventures. What about going back to Bordeaux, or going over to France? You'd initially decided, no, I want South Africa, I want the Cape, not France. You've now, after your time learning wine in South Africa, headed over. What was that change like? How intimidating, exciting was it to now find yourself in the very heart of wine country?
It was awe-inspiring. But we very soon got accepted into the sort of rather close circle of Bordeaux people. And it was fun. I tried to study at Sorbonne when I was young, but there were too many distractions. I think it must have been all the pretty girls around Paris that made me forget the books. But I'm very, very attached to France. And we miss it. We go to Susie and I, who has been with me all these years. We celebrated our 55th wedding anniversary the other day. We go to Paris at least 3 or 4 times a year, and it's like a tonic,
I got back from Paris yesterday. Don't visit quite as often as you do, but it is great for the soul, and lovely to spend time over there. The time that you did spend, there were so many different chapters just in the French section, but in particular, I think it was Hugh Johnson I was reading, who's both a great friend and a great admirer of yours, talking about Grave and white wine and some of the revolutionary stuff that you did. You brought a number of new dimensions to wine in France during your time there, Peter.
Yes. It was something that started at Vitrebai, a theory that every vineyard has its own yeast. And I was lucky enough to be able to prove it in Bordeaux in 1985, I think, with a yeast experiment using 3 yeasts from 3 different vineyards in the same must. And it was clear to everybody who came and tasted it that this was indeed so. And it inspired a friend of mine, Denis Dubourdieu, who was professor at the university, to open a yeast laboratory. And he later told my nephew that it took him 20 years to prove scientifically what I proved by intuition. So it was a great breakthrough. In fact, I think it's wine. If you look at it as part of wine history, it certainly is a very important part, because it does prove that every vineyard has its own yeast, therefore its own signature. And if I was in a cooperative, of course, I would use canned yeast, and I would do it looking at the must and deciding which taste we should give into it. But I am not. I have my own little vineyard, and therefore, for me, it's very important that that the wines from here should taste like the wines are here. It's part of terroir, this misused word, and it's a very, very important part of the terroir. And that I can thank Vitrebai for.
That understanding of terroir and the understanding of what you do, we'll take some credit from as South Africa for forming the foundation of that knowledge. But when you went, you mentioned you knew by intuition what they've been trying for so long to get. Was that perhaps in part due to the nature of the way you learned stuff in South Africa, the opportunity you had here, perhaps the research that education gave you a different perspective to what people had in France when you went over?
Well, I don't know. It was just sort of a cycle of sorts that came in, and also part of my childhood. Of course, we had a lot of different wines at my home, and my father, in fact, bought a hogshead of Lanspage every year, and that was supposed to be the daily wine. But you mustn't forget that wines didn't cost very much in those days, and so I remembered an evening where we had Léoville Lascaz and Léoville Porphyre, and they live in the same courtyard. One on one side of the courtyard and the other on the other, and their wines were totally different, and it made me speculate because when I was at Nitforby, we made a lot of tests on the wines on various parts of the Cape, and at the end of the day, they all tasted the same because we used the same yeast making them, and I thought this cannot be true. There's something completely wrong in this. Of course, I was scolded. I was the youngest in the team. But the thought stuck with me. And when I came to France, I realized that I had to do something about it.
Which you clearly did, and did very successfully. Not just in France, though. And Peter, I was working on this earlier, and it made my job even harder preparing for our conversation. It is harder to find a country where you haven't made wine than to run through the countries where you have. And I'm looking at this list, and again, I had to double check this because countries like Brazil come up, and Kenya come up, and places where we know they do not make wine, Peter, and yet you clearly have. Tell me about this exotic part of your winemaking story.
Well, one day when I was in Bordeaux, a friend rang me up from Robin Gold, rang me up from London, and asked me if I could do something. He was at the board of National Distillers, an American thing, and asked me that if I could go to Brazil and make a wine that they could export. And what were the terms? And I said 2 first-class ticket on the old Brazilian barrique, and everything paid. And he said yes immediately. And this adventure lasted for about 3 or 4 years, and it was a wonderful time to go there once a year. And I must say, Brazil was one of the nicest places to work in. The people were really understanding and so on. And we came in the first day, and I saw something I was not at all acquainted with. And it wasn't on my curriculum what I had to make there. But I saw the white must, and it was dark brown like tea. And I said, listen, we have to do something about this. And then I told them I told the winemaker to move his office down into the laboratory, which he did reluctantly. But after a while, he was very grateful, because once we were in the laboratory, we could then dose every batch of wine with tiny amounts of sulfur and in small beakers. And then we could see when the oxidase didn't appear, we knew the minimum sulfur to add to the wine to keep it green and nice. And the next morning, we had all these green juices in, and I won them over. They became friends for life, actually. It was fun.
The father of the Brazilian wine industry, Peter Vinding-Diers.
No way.
I think I've actually got a bottle or two of Brazilian wine in my cellar. I've never been brave enough to try them, but I might open one this weekend and see how they go. We're not familiar with wine from Brazil or from Kenya or some of the other countries, but we are familiar certainly by name. We don't see too much of it here, but we certainly know what it is. Tokai and the sweet wine of Hungary. And that was you and Hugh Johnson, wasn't it? Digging that up and revitalizing sweet wine in Hungary.
Yeah, that was an amazing challenge, because yes, we wanted to. I mean, the old Tokais were beautiful. No, they were really amongst the world's top wines. But then after the war, they became you couldn't drink them. And when somebody offered us the possibility of going there and try and redo it, we went. And it was a great opportunity, a great challenge, many fights, a lot of ignorance. And when we got through, we found out how they used to make the wines. It apparently was a big, deep secret because nobody would tell us. So we had to ask the old owners who'd gone to Vienna or other places after the Soviets moved in. And so slowly we could piece together this puzzle. And then I went up to see the Minister of Agriculture, George Rasko, who was a fantastic person. And I presented him with what we'd done. And he said, yes, this is exactly what it used to be. This wine has to be the benchmark for future. And it was such a triumph. It really was. I still have a lovely house in Tokai, and we go there perhaps once a year, not enough. But I'm no longer connected with the Royal Tokai Wine Company. It's changed owners so many times. But Hugh said then, it will take 30 years for this to get off. And it did. He was absolutely right. It's doing very well today. And they do make some beautiful wines.
Would that be then, of all the extraordinary things you've done in the wine world, one that gives you particular satisfaction when you were able to take something, and yes, it's taken time, and yes, it's now in other hands, but together with Hugh, you were the architects of a very special rebirth of an incredibly unique and much celebrated wine.
Yes, it was fun. And, I stood in an antiquarian bookshop. I love books. And so I stood in this bookshop and looked at a small Latin book, and it happened to be the 1700 classification of Tokai, with all the clima, all the growths, all the climatic things, and of course it was just too good to be true, and so at the Royal we then started swapping people because we knew where the first growths were. And we moved up on the sides of the valley and so on, where they moved down into the bottom, and so we started to plant some wonderful vineyards. And I suggested we should have on the portfolio 2 or 3 first growths and at least 1 second growth, just to see people understand the difference between these things. And it was such fun. It really was.
All of these chapters coming together, all this knowledge and understanding that you have of the wine world, a very established name in Bordeaux. You could have pretty much picked and chosen from what you wanted to do next. Either, right, I'm going to go and run a first growth, or I'm going to go and make wine in Papua New Guinea. Instead, you settled on Sicily, a place I've been to. It is beautiful. And having a look at Tim Atkin's report of late on Etna, it's an area where wine is very much on the up, it would appear. But what was it initially that made you think, right, I'm going to take my wine journey to Sicily as its next destination?
Well, I hope it's going to be the last. But yes, we had a great friend in Rome called Giorgio Franchetti, who was the uncle of Andrea Franchetti, who was an old pupil of mine. And Andrea had made this wonderfully successful wine in Val d'Orcia, and then the uncle said, "You must go to Sicily, Peter. That Sicily is for you. I can see that you're not very happy in Tuscany and all that, but go to Sicily. That's your place." And so I went, and we started a thing together with Andrea up on the Etna. And I'm glad to say it has become a great success. But he had to carry on alone. We couldn't be 2 together there. And so I went down the mountain, and we found this. This is another old volcano. Very beautiful. And suddenly I saw all the potential of this place. And I remember Eben Sadi coming to visit us, and he said, "My God, Peter, this is a fabulous place." And he was right. It is a fabulous place, and we are able to produce some very, very agreeable wines from here, which, of course, now you have the opportunity to taste in South Africa, which I can tell you, it fills me with such joy to know that my wines have finally come back to that lovely country.
Well, they have indeed. And if you keep a close eye on the Dan Really Likes Wine store with Norman Goodfellows, we're going to have some of Peter's wines available in the coming weeks, including one, Peter, that I drank a little earlier on today. And before we talk about the wine in particular, I need to talk about the naming and about an act that's probably even braver than parachuting into Vietnam, Peter. You named a wine after your wife. Now, I have a Greek lawyer of a wife, but all wives are then quite similar. If you do not get this right, Peter, you are in a world of trouble. So you definitely set yourself a bar for this one.
It's absolutely true. I had it already in Bordeaux. And as I adore my wife, I have to take really care when I make that blend every year. and I'm very happy when she's happy about it. It's not always the case, but it is certainly in 2021. It's a very good blend. I saw it as one of the best blends we made that year.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that blend. People watching the show think, oh, wine from Sicily, those will be Italian grapes. This must have some Sangiovese in or some Barolo. It's going to be something that's very Italian. It, of course, is not. These are grapes that we would recognize from certainly South Africa, from the slopes of different parts of France. There's not an Italian grape to be seen in the traditional sense. And again, I think it speaks to your idea of terroir and understanding things instinctively. Tell me about the grapes that you are planting at Montecarrubo and why they work so well where you are, and in particular in this Suzanne blend that's a tribute to your wonderful wife.
Yes, I mean, we soon realized that Sicily is a very, very old viticultural country. And the oldest wines they found here date from around 3,000 years ago. They're very, very exciting wines, I think. But since then, a number of varieties have come in that, for me, with my Bordeaux culture coming, are less interesting. I like elegant wines. I don't like hard edges and hard tannins. I abhor hard tannins. And so I had no other choice than go for, say, Syrah, which I did. And luckily, we knew some people in Hermitage, in Côte-d'Or, and they kind of gave us two Marsal selections. You know, Marsal selections, when you go in your vineyard and you select the vines that are growing well under your conditions in your soil and so on. So no clone. And we planted them, and now for the last 12 years, I think, I've been walking in the vineyard and selected the vines that are apt or that are happy in my climate. And those we've just planted 1.5 hectares of them. And it makes a huge difference to have vines that are happy and so on. Of course, legacy to Ponky, Pongrads, who taught me. And it's very, very satisfactory to see that. It's in fact great fun.
And in the context of the broader style of wine from where you are, my one visit to the island included some time in Taormina, where I picked up plenty of Greek heritage. Well, actually, my Greek wife proudly pointed it out and claimed that her family had built everything on the island years ago. And then going back to Greece, as I have over the years, looking at last summer in Greece, where we did this show from a number of different vineyards, tasting the change and the improvement in red wine from Greece, from the Greek islands, and a beautifully elegant and accessible and gentle style of red wine that has become more and more dominant in Greece that I've seen over the last few years. Is that a fair reflection of red wine in Sicily and where you're trying to take the wine that you're producing?
Well, you know, the old varieties came from Greece, And in fact, we're planting some white that have a DNA of 3,000 years, and we expect a very fantastic quality out of them. There's also some reds. The thing about these wines is that they never make more than about 11.5, 12 degrees. So for a climate change, they are absolutely ideal to plant. And it's something I think one should think about. At least we who live here, we have to think about those things. And there's a lovely one called Tassa and Lassa. And take it or leave it or whatever. And it makes the most wonderful red wine you can imagine. So we will definitely experiment with that.
It's an absolute joy. I think back, Peter, to my first Greek wine experience 12, 13 years ago, and realizing that Greek red wine was only on the plane that I was on because they had it as backup for aviation fuel. It has changed dramatically, and I think there's a lot of red in this part of the world that is becoming increasingly exciting to drink, and clearly still filling you with a great deal of joy and excitement. After so many years, though, you've spent so much time making wine in every possible place. What is it that keeps you going? What gets you up in the morning saying, yes, I want to make even more wine. I want to keep playing around with and making magic in cellars?
Well, I think it's very important to have an open mind and no dogmas, no stigmas, and just get on. And there's so many things to be done, you know. I certainly haven't finished, I hope, yet, because it is a challenge. Every day is a challenge. You know, the vineyard is like the sea. It changes its face every day, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And so you walk in the vineyard and you look at things, and we were sitting a bit out today and walking there, and then talking to the people who work with us, and it's just so nice.
I'm going to come back to South Africa in just a moment, because I know when I ask you which was your favorite wine place, South Africa will be absolutely top of the list. But as your second best wine region, when you look back over the career, where is the other place that has given you collectively, from the wine experience and the life experience, the best memories?
Bordeaux, without a doubt. It's a wonderful place. The wines are fantastic, classics, great classics. And I mean, if you really, as Rich said to me, if you really love wine, you have to go past Bordeaux at least once in your life. I also think Burgundy makes some lovely wine. Côte-d'Or, of course, which I'm very influenced by. And when we are in France, I always buy some frightfully expensive wines, because I'm in the schoolroom, and that's a very important place to be in if you are somebody like me. And so there we are.
It's a firm endorsement of Bordeaux, and I think it's fair to say Bordeaux is that good that it could almost be the Stellenbosch of France. That's how impressive it is. Let's head back to Stellenbosch then in closing, and the time you spent there. Go back to that time in South Africa and the formative years spent in your wine career. What are some of those particular memories, Peter, from those years that really stand out, that decades on are still fresh and vivid for the impact they had upon you?
I don't know. I think the people who worked with on the farm were absolutely wonderful. The old span, as they called it then, I don't know what you call them now, but they were fantastic people. I'm so grateful to them, because they taught me. You know, they taught me a lot, and they were fun. Great to be with them. I was with them all the day, you know, when I was not in the cellar, and that I think has helped me working with people in future, because you know, you have to have a human inroad when you work with people, and we had a wonderful time together.
And if you look as an extension to all of that on a particular wine, and this is a difficult one, I asked Michael Fridjon a similar question once, and he gave me 1,400 answers, and we eventually had to stop recording. But was there a wine in South Africa where you drank it and it spoke to you, and that was a wine that influenced you or gave you a real kickstart in the direction of the kind of wine you wanted to make and the kind of winemaker you wanted to be?
I'll tell you, I went to France in 73, and we came back and we made the Rosenberg 74. And I came back, I had seen, observation is very important at our job. And so I've observed that they pruned very hard in Bordeaux. And I came back with that observation, and we pruned the old Cabernet at Rosenberg from 1945. It was planted. We pruned that. People said brutally, but we actually made a very good, I don't know if you remember the Rosenberg 74, but it was worth drinking, I think. And I got some of it. Rach let me have some of it, and I took it to France with me. And we blind tasted it one evening, and everybody thought it was Vieux Chateau d'Artin from Pomerol. And it was a great moment. I think the yeast of Rosenberg had a lot of similarities to the other one. I don't know, I can't explain why, but that was the case. And that gave me enormous satisfaction. And I was so proud on behalf of South Africa then.
And rightly so. And as a South African, because you're very much an honorary one, and will remain so even over in Sicily, we get quite a lot of winemakers who watch the show as well as being guests on it. And I know there'll be many watching at the moment. Peter, if you could sum up from this adventure, I don't want to call it a career because it's far too cool to just be a career. If you could look back on your adventure and give a younger and aspiring winemaker a kernel or two of advice that on reflection you think might help nudge them in the right direction as their own journeys continue to unfold.
Oh, well, I will say observation and humble. Observe and be humble. Never think you made the best wine in the world.
All right. So basically the opposite to being a wine marketer, who, of course, we have on the show from time to time as well. Peter, thank you. It's been fascinating reading the book. I'm almost come to a conclusion. I think we're going to need to have you back on the show again, though, because there's a lot more to unpack. I have had my first glass of the Suzanne a little earlier on today. And I don't think it's quite as lovely as your wife. Let me not tempt her wrath, but it was an absolute delight, as it has been catching up with you. And I think as much as Michael Fridjon told me a great story, he undersold it somewhat, and it's been lovely sharing some of it with you, and hopefully not only the chance to share some more of it in due course, but also to get over to Sicily to come and see this volcano in which you're making wine, and to have a glass in person.
Perfect. You're welcome anytime.
Peter Vinding-Diers, thank you very, very much indeed. The Danish aristocrat who as a youngster sailed past Cape Town on part of a trip where he bought the entire stock of champagne on board while heading up towards Mauritius. Just one of many misadventures of this wonderful, wonderful guest we've had on the show today, and whose wines, Montecarrubo, available at the Dan Really Likes Wine store and through Norman Goodfellows, a taste of Sicily, but more importantly, the taste of a winemaker with this extraordinarily varied history and heritage, but he calls South Africa home in terms of his wine education. So look out for those coming soon. And having tasted a couple of them already, you are in for a real treat. That is it for today. We stay with Italy, though. Join us back on the show next Monday, where a number of Italian guests tell me what to eat and drink when I touch down on the Amalfi Coast next weekend to make sure I get the very best of Italia. Well, that sounds like the very best of Italia is to be found in Sicily with a Danish South African called Peter. Dan Really Likes Wine, brought to you by Norman Goodfellows. Don't forget the chance to win a great dining experience with Haute Cabrières with our competition this month. Buy any bottle of Haute Cabrières, either online or in-store, and a dining experience in Cape Town, Durban or Johannesburg will be all yours. It's that simple to enter. Big thank you to Peter Vinding-Diers and to Michael Fridjohn, Michael Crossley and the team at Reciprocal. We will see you next week from Brookfield at Royal Developments at Royal Johannesburg. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye. In the month of May, your chance to win a fine dining experience with Norman Goodfellows, Haute Cabrières and Dan Really Likes Wine. Simply buy any bottle of Haute Cabrières wine. That could be a bottle of the Pierre Jordan Bubbles or one of their still wines, including the brand new Reserve range, and you'll go into the draw to win a night out for 2 people for a fine dining experience valued at 15,000 Rand at either the Nines in Cape Town, Bel Punto in Durban or Marble in Johannesburg. Get your wine either online at any of the Norman Goodfellows stores or online at the Dan Really Likes Wine store, and you're in the draw to win that fabulous prize through the month of May with Haute Cabrières, Norman Goodfellows and Dan Really Likes Wine.